Thank you very much for joining us on a Sunday morning. It might seem a little bit depressing for Sunday morning talking about the breakdown of the world order, but I assure you we've got a great panel who are going to bring the whole topic to life. This discussion's been, I think, in various forms kind of playing out at the Battle of Ideas Festival for many years. I think I've been involved in a variety of sessions that have touched on similar themes because it's been clear for many years and is becoming clearer and clearer that something kind of tectonic is shifting in the way that global geopolitics plays itself out. And this has given rise to quite a number of different interpretations as to what's really going on, whether it's like kind of the breakdown of the previous Western-led world order without anything to replace it, or whether there's a kind of emerging alternative vision or geopolitical nexus coming into being that's led by challenging powers, whether that's China or the global South or something put together by Russia. So this is a very of the moment discussion. We're continuing, as I say, to see all this play out, and there's barely a discussion about any of the major geopolitical conflicts that doesn't also immediately kind of turn into a discussion about the whole world order itself as such. So there really is an awful lot to dig into here, and I'm really glad that we've managed to put together a really excellent panel who I'll introduce you to very briefly in the order that they're going to speak. I should say I'm Jacob Reynolds. Hello, welcome. The head of policy for the think tank MCC Brussels, as well as being an associate fellow of the Academy of Ideas, who put on this festival, the Battle of Ideas. I've maintained an interest in these topics for quite some time, so I'm really delighted that I was asked to chair this session. But anyway, on to my panel, who are all more interesting than me. We'll first be hearing from Phil Mullan, who's sitting over here. He's a writer, a lecturer, a business manager. He's the author of a very important book called Beyond Confrontation, Globalists, Nationalists and Their Discontent. He writes widely on issues related to the economy, but also to geopolitics and the way that especially the way that those two issues interact. So a big warm welcome to Phil. Thomas Fazi, sitting on my left, is a journalist and writer. He's the author of Reclaiming the State, Progressive Vision for Sovereignty in a Post-Neoliberal World. He's columnist at Unheard, contributing editor at Compact, and for me, most especially, I want to flag to you that he's the author of a number of really important reports that we put together at MCC Brussels and has been leading our charge to unmask the hidden influence of especially the NGO industrial complex on European and European Union politics. I really recommend that you go to our website. Really delighted that he's here over in the UK with us. Thomas. Over here on my far left is William C. Hicks. He's the co-chair of the Life Sciences Practice Group, MINTS, which he basically works in capital markets. And I was trying to put into better words why that's kind of relevant for this discussion. But it's obviously quite important the way that global money moves around and forms and plays a role in forming this the changing kind of geopolitical order. So I'm hoping, as well as being our kind of a resident voice from America for this panel, which is obviously crucial to this whole discussion, the role of America, it has a lot of this expertise in the way that the global economy works. So really big welcome to William. And then we'll hear from Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, who's a columnist and commentator for The Telegraph, Unheard, GB News, and various outlets both in France and the UK. She was just saying that she's developed a reputation unfairly in France of being known as the kind of the voice of Brexit in France and the voice of France for Brexiteers. But she says she's not actually a Brexiteer. She's just someone who understands why it was that the UK voted, and that's enough to be blackballed and blacklisted by her in the salons of France. So anyway, a big warm welcome to you, Anne-Elisabeth. Phil, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jacob, and good morning to all of you. As Jacob implied, there's no doubt that the old order is over, but what I think we need to question this morning is the other consensus, which is that we are en route to a new world order, to another sort of global arrangement for managing relations between countries, to some revamped, rules-based order, but probably with different countries dominating. But I think that presumption is far too restrictive to really understand what's going on today. The old rules-based order was a very specific response to the chaos, to the bloodshed of the 1930s and the 1940s. And it was also distinctive because of the conclusion drawn by the victorious elites of America, Britain, France, so on, that nationhood itself had become a huge problem. With Germany, Italy, and France, Germany, Italy, and Japan in mind, they concluded that nations and popular democratic sovereignty could not be trusted. And so it needed to be constrained by global rules, by global institutions. Now, my argument is that there is nothing destined about that type of top-down international system. Over the past 250 years, such an institutionalized settlement is very much the anomaly. And at best, it only functioned for something like 40 years to maintain relative peace. But I think in truth, that relative stability was the result of the Cold War. So we need to heed that truism that history never repeats itself. There's no necessity for a rules-based scheme to recur. It's also instructive, I find, that the specific phrase New World Order was barely uttered outside two specific historical periods. First, it was coined by the American president Woodrow Wilson at the end of the First World War when he was promoting his US-led League of Nations. Yet once the League was actually set up, without the US as we know, the New World Order idiom fell from use, including even during the planning for the post-1945 globalist order. It was as if all the blood, sweat, and tears of actually reordering the world was too intense to be captured by those three bland words. And the term only resurfaced into use from the late 1980s, when the old order was starting to unravel at the end of the Cold War. And since then, we've heard it from everybody, from Bush Sr., from Margaret Thatcher, and from pretty much every American president, British Prime Minister, and most other Western leaders. I think what those two historical instances suggest is that the phrase New World Order has been used mostly when international order is absent, rather than when an order actually exists. The new order is always something desired primarily by the elites of the dominant incumbent power of powers as an idealistic, and today I think a nostalgic, yearning for a top-down organized world that could preserve their privileged positions. And I think that's where we are today. So given the injustice, given the illiberalism, given the contempt for the demos, which was perpetrated by that old globalist anti-national order, rather than repeat the mantra New World Order, I think we should pursue constructing stronger democratic nation states again, because that would enable inter-country relations to be worked out on a freely decided basis between equal sovereign states. And I think we can forge this national democratic objective by addressing the key features of today's interregnum, while trying to prevent them turning into a barbaric and disastrous conflagration. So, three distinctive aspects to leave you with. First, although domestic politics always intrudes into foreign affairs, I think what is new and precarious today is that at home, the Western nations are effectively leaderless. It's not just Britain, not just France. I think Trump too has a national authority problem. And it's a lack of authoritative Western leaders, which I think has brought polarization and conflicts at home, but has also exacerbated the existing confusions about the national interest. And I think this leaderlessness compounds the danger of arbitrary, unpredictable foreign policy interventions, which will likely reinforce geopolitical fragmentation and international de-alignment. Second, amplifying America's destabilizing influence in the world, I think, is its peculiar combination of strength and vulnerability. At least since the financial crisis, we all know that the US has been openly retrenching its world leadership. But although it no longer has the same global authority as before, it remains by far the world's wealthiest country with the biggest military, making it a much more influential player compared, say, to Britain in the last interregnum, Britain as the declining superpower. But also, America's wealth is very fragile because of the country's vast external indebtedness. It's dependent on others for its financing. And I think it's this fusion of what I call precarious might, which creates the tinderbox of America as a muscular and potentially explosive power that is seeking to retain the old status quo with its dominance intact. Third final feature is the perilous reluctance, I think, of the Western elites to accept the rise of the rest and the upgrading of many non-Western nations to achieve a level of power. Again, that's different to the last interregnum, when there were at most a dozen or so significant players around the world. Today, economic production is spread among many more mid-sized nations, which means that geopolitical influence is also much more widely spread, adding to the complexity of today's international configuration. Alongside the rise of China as a superpower and the economic takeoff of India, there are another 20 or so mid-sized powers which we could list, which are acting as independent nations, both seeking to pursue their own interests, but also resistant to being told by the Old West about how to act, about who to trade with or who not to trade with. So I think just those three distinctive features imply that we're in for an indefinite period of multiple, tangled, fluid coalitions and alignments. And to negotiate the complexities of this era of hiatus, and before we can expect to reach any world order again, we need to build strong, democratic nation states at home.
Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lots of issues already on the table, but I'll turn straight over to Thomas for your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. I would like to premise my talk by saying that this is not a crisis like others that the world has experienced over the past century or even more. I think we are living through what is arguably the greatest geopolitical transition in human history. What we're witnessing, what we have witnessed already, in fact, is effectively the end of 500 years, give or take, of Western economic, political, and military global hegemony, which, of course, for about 30 years following the end of the Cold War, manifested itself in the form of an absolute, unchallenged U.S. Western global supremacy. Now, that world is clearly over. It's finished. And I think much of the chaos, the violence, and the disruptions that we are experiencing are fundamentally a result of this, a consequence of this, and more specifically a consequence, and Phil mentioned it already, of the Western elites and ruling classes' inability to accept this reality, to accept the fact that they are no longer the top dogs and to accept that they are no longer the masters of the universe. I think it's really important to try and understand what this means on a psychological level for people that have viewed themselves as essentially being the masters of the universe for so long. And one might say that this is making them go crazy in the clinical sense of the term, hence all the psychopolitical degenerations that we're witnessing all around us. And I say this is the biggest geopolitical transition in human history because, of course, empires and hegemonic systems have risen and fallen in the past. I know I'm Roman, but never before has this occurred on a truly global scale. Never before has it occurred in a world that was so incredibly interconnected. Never before has the declining hegemon, i.e. the US, had a truly global reach, such as the one that the US does have today, with around 700 military bases, give or take, still spread across every continent. And never before has it occurred in the age of nuclear weapons. So this makes it not only the greatest geopolitical transition in human history, but also the most dangerous geopolitical transition ever. In fact, one might say that we are living through the most dangerous moment humanity has ever faced. And I think I often get the impression that people don't appreciate this point enough. And so I think the real question is, will we survive this transition? And the concept of Thucydides' trap tells us that there are very few examples in history where the displacement of an established power by a rising power or powers hasn't led to war. This is one of history's main lessons. And indeed, we can see Thucydides' trap already playing out. We are already witnessing the US resort to all sorts of tools, and Phil already mentioned this, including violence, to slow down, halt, or, from their perspective, ideally reverse this process of multipolarization. And this has already led to war. The war in Ukraine is fundamentally a conflict between NATO and Russia that was largely caused by NATO's and the US's decades-long strategy of containing, destabilizing, and ideally breaking up Russia from their point of view, which U.S. planners have always viewed as a key obstacle to U.S. control of the Eurasian and even the Western European theater. So one might say that the Third World War has already begun, to the extent that, in a wider sense, of course, the conflict in Ukraine is also an even wider conflict between the West and the wider non-Western alliance that Russia is part of. And that, of course, includes China. And in this sense, the warmongering rhetoric that we hear from European politicians constantly today is nothing short of terrifying. And I think it's a clear example of the kind of psychopolitical degeneration that I mentioned earlier. And I think this is all the more astonishing given that while the war in Ukraine has, I would say, proven beneficial to the U.S. in many respects. It has driven a wedge between Europe and Russia, which has always been a strategic imperative for America. It has boosted NATO, which has always been a tool of U.S. control of Europe, and it has made Europe heavily dependent on American energy. So not bad overall for the U.S., but it has proven completely disastrous for Europe. And I think this is no accident. I think the U.S. is making it amply clear, especially since Trump's second coming, that they view Europe as a territory to be economically cannibalized. And so I think, especially in this day and age, any talk of a common Western or transatlantic interest in this context, I think, is ludicrous. I think now more than ever is it apparent that Europe and the U.S. have very different interests, and now more than ever, I think Europe should break free from Washington's tutelage. But as we know, the opposite is happening. Europe today is more hyper vassalized than it's to America than it's ever been before in post-war history. And this is one of the paradoxes that maybe we'll be discussing a bit more further on. And so I think generally I would say yes, we are already living in a world war. I think if we survive this, future historians will describe 2025 as a year in which the world was already at war, even though it maybe wasn't apparent to everyone. And I think this is a war that isn't just playing out in Ukraine. I think there are various fronts of this sort of piecemeal global war. I think what is happening in the Middle East is also another front in this war. Even putting aside any sort of moral considerations about, Israel's policies in Gaza and elsewhere, about which I may have different views to people in this room, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I would think, from a purely geopolitical perspective, I think what is happening there is connected to this wider decline of the Western hegemonic system. After all, we know that Israel is very much a product of the post-war U.S.-led order, and so I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask whether Israel can survive in its current form once that order collapses. I think this is a question that everyone should be asking, especially, I would say, Israel supporters. I think it's something that Israel's elites are very aware of, which is why I think, I think what part of what we're witnessing in the Middle East is Israel trying to make the most of what they see as a closing window of opportunity. Basically, this from a purely geopolitical perspective. This is, I think it's, this is something that's often overshadowed by other aspects of the discussion, but this is, I think, very important. And so, and then, of course, there's also the issue of Israel as a tool of U.S. policy in the Middle East. And that, of course, also relates to this wider conflict between the West and China. The U.S. bombing of Iran is clearly connected to, Iran's role as a key piece of the wider BRICS order. So it's all connected, basically. That's what I would say. And of course, I've managed to barely mention China, which is, of course, a very big player in this whole story. But I'm sure we'll have a chance to do that later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. And yes, plenty of time for us to dig into some of the things that we haven't had time to mention yet. But for now, William.
Yeah, I used to live here in high school, and I remember when in the 80s, and the dollar had just gotten up to $1.06, and someone in the press asked Prince Charles if the pound was in trouble, and he said, well, the dollar's just catching up. And I kind of feel that way about, the global order. I don't feel like the U.S. is in decline. I just feel like other countries are catching up, and we've been aware of that, and in some ways we've welcomed that. So I don't see this as big of a pivot point. We've certainly been aware of the threat of China for a very long time. We're also very aware of the opportunity of China for a very long time, and they're both there. It just is what it is. So in terms of, I guess what I'll try to address is my perspective on the sort of change in U.S. behavior. I don't think it's as new as it seems. There have been some significant issues that we've been dealing with. One, strategic overreach has been an issue. We're worried about China, we're worried about Russia, and then all of a sudden we're in Afghanistan and spending tons of money, or we're spending tons of money in Ukraine without a play-to-win strategy. That's been an issue for a long time, and I think it's being addressed more directly now when it probably should have been addressed earlier. The other issue is decline in our manufacturing base. It's and that's both a domestic and a strategic issue. It's very concerning that I think China can manufacture 1,000 boats for every one boat we manufacture. It's kind of a problem. The fact that critical technological components are being manufactured mostly in Taiwan, which is pretty close to China. But it's also a huge domestic issue. We've become, in large ways, a country of service providers. We've done very well. People have become very affluent, but there's not a vibrant working class, which creates dislocation socially, but it also makes it difficult for us to solve our manufacturing problem because we don't have people that you don't have the skilled workforce anymore, and we don't have the manufacturing capability. So those are very serious issues. They've been issues for a while. I'd say the Band-Aids, Trump's been, some people say what other people are already thinking. Trump's been screaming what everybody was already thinking. These are issues we need to deal with, and they're not going away. So the issues with what's changed, the kind of trade policy, I think that's tariffs are complicated, and I don't know anyone who's happy with the immediate outcomes. But the idea of trying to get cutting deals, get people to do manufacturing in the U.S., trying to reinvigorate our industrial base, that's serious stuff. And I don't think it's going to turn out to be partisan. I think that even if Trump leaves, you're going to see more of it. But I don't think we see this as we're in decline and our vassals are acting up. I don't think we've ever seen Europe as vassals. That's the first time I heard that. We just want them to carry their share of the load. And I remember when Trump started talking about NATO, I do a decent amount of business here. So many people were saying, well, fair enough, we really should be paying more, from a lay perspective, you can go back to Clinton. People were saying NATO should be paying more and the NATO states should be paying more. And the response was a polite brush off. It wasn't until Trump said, well, okay, then maybe we're going to stop, that it actually got a reaction. So some of this is just stuff that's been brewing. But I think from the American perspective, we're just looking for more co-equal allies that are actually, defending themselves. And I think that's healthier in all kinds of ways. So I don't think we're at a crisis point. I think, there is a lot of tension with China, but there's also a lot of mutual interdependence with China. They have their own issues internally. And I think, I guess I'm more optimistic. I think the world has a lot more to gain, not going crazy on each other. And I think the forces are mostly pushing it that way.
Great, brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, last introduction goes to Anne-Elisabeth. Over to you.
And bonjour, good morning. I find it fascinating to have to come about the attitude to sort of changing of our world from a country that wants to resist that change as violently if necessary and as sort of stubbornly as possible. France is a country that has once driven change. It drove change in ideas. The French Revolution essentially shaped most of the history of the Western world in terms of ideas in the 19th century. We may have lost at Waterloo, but the ideas sort of rode across Europe. Lots of the European countries would not look the way they do now without French ideas. And it was the same thing in technology, in fashion, in art, in writing. And so what went wrong for my country that we are unable to look at the new, except to say we don't want it and we really want to retire at age 60 and not 62 and perish the thought not 64, which is the debate that can make and break a government in France. And we've just been having an object lesson in this right now. So how does that work? And why are we, in so many ways, why are we no longer adaptable and why are we not resilient? There are many, many instances nowadays of the lack of resilience that has been inculcated into our children and which sort of seep through this education, through our world now. But essentially, it is the incapacity to take anything that disturbs what you took some time to acquire or what was drummed into you and to make it a personal offense. And Jacob mentioned my sort of the strange reputation I have in France of being pro-Brexit. I'm actually, being French, I think that when you have a large nation like Britain, you can really get more or less what you want, the way we French do it, in Brussels, without necessarily getting through the awful pain of getting out of the whole system. But, I understand, as I said, why people would want sovereignty, independence. I think it's not been managed very well, but it doesn't matter. However, I am called a Brexiteer precisely because the idea that you can understand the point of view at the other side is impossible in France. If you think, that's the one thing we're still pioneers, is believe me, if we do it, you guys are doing it too. Your children are doing it in the streets, and then it will come to everyone. It comes to the organization. So be very afraid. Do not think that you're exempt from it. That would be one thing. The other question about this is, I think the New World Order was ad hoc, and the people who brought it, organized it, were not they were not thinking of global conspiracy. They've just won an extremely difficult war. They just were faced with ruined countries, literally in rubble. And what they crafted at Bretton Woods, which is almost more important than the creation of the UN and other institutions of the New World, was really something that we have to look back on thinking this was well-meaning. The entire conversation nowadays is to despise the Western world, is to despise what the Western world was trying to achieve. It's to create sins in the way that the Spanish Inquisition did. This is, you're a colonialist and you're a non-person and you should be cancelled. And all those institutions have got to be, and everybody who sort of talks against this has got a sort of trick card and a joker, and they brandish it, and you're out. And that's something in which we have to learn to defend ourselves first by seeing what it is that they're doing, which is actually not new in terms of creating enemies of the states, enemies of the revolution. I mean, we French again invented that. The Bolsheviks used it. Lenin was reading Robespierre obsessively. The death of the imperial family in Russia was decided because he thought that killing the king, the queen, etc., was a good idea in France. So our influence, for good or bad, has been there throughout. We no longer want to have an influence. I don't think there's anybody here in this room who's willing to go to the barricades to save their pension age. Possibly a better pension, yes, but your pension age, I'm not so sure. However, we also have, and in the New World Order, what we have seen examples of resilience that should encourage us to think the Western world is not yet on its last legs. I will disagree politely with Thomas. I think the war in Ukraine was essentially caused by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in two stages, in 2014 and in 22. And the capacity of Ukrainians for resilience and for invention is something that should give us pause. The capacity of a country that I happen to have visited since 1994 to use the good things that existed in the old Eastern European and communist world, which was a first-class education system, and to craft this into a tolerant society with a lively democracy, with faults, with people say, oh, the Ukrainians are all corrupt and they're all Nazis. There still is a bit of corruption. There's definitely not Nazis in Ukraine. They polled 2% in the elections of 2019 when Zelensky won. They are so Nazi that they elected a Jewish president whom they still follow nowadays, and they disagree with him, which was democracy is all about. They may very well, like Churchill, vote him out at the end of the war, but I believe that there will be a vote for that. We have that to learn, but we also have to learn on the capacity of inventing and reinventing things like war. All Western nations are now looking, NATO, which is not always popular, but NATO is studying what the Ukrainians are doing to reshape the form of a conflict. Russia is sending missiles that are sort of crafted in Iran or crafted by themselves and paid by the Chinese, and the Ukrainians kill those missiles with drones that cost $400, and half of which have been reshaped from something they bought off Amazon. This inventiveness, they have 5 drones to kill one missile, because the missile is an expensive piece of technology and it does things when it goes up, it goes in the curve in which it goes down, etc. 5 different drones at different stages of the missile's trajectory, and they can kill it. That is, to me, a reason for optimism of a country that wants to have elections, that want to remain a Western country, that wants to anchor itself to the much maligned European Union. And I'm not going to defend many of the things that the European Union does, but all the same. So we see the same thing in Israel. We're more used to Israel being an incredibly sort of technological wonder, and this youth, which is supposed to be hedonistic and is now sort of exporting cooks, this is very new in the Jewish world. And all the same, they were capable of going and waging a difficult war. So I don't think the West is killed. I think the new world is going to be different, but I think we have enough to shift ourselves so that we can live in it in a society that we'll recognize as accepting our values.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's come straight out to the audience. It's obviously inevitable that people are going to raise particular countries or particular conflicts in the context of this discussion. But just to note that we are, as much as possible, we'll try and keep it at the kind of tectonic level. But of course, you're the audience and you're free to take it. I'll be like, right.
I'd just be interested in what the panel thinks about a coming cataclysmic event and what effect it's going to have to sort of accentuate the trends that various different people have identified. So it seems to me that there is a coming financial crisis. You can look at all the sort of, there's always a big technology. Everyone says it's going to change the world. Then everyone has doubts about it. All the sort of doubts around AI being publicly expressed. There's massive government indebtedness and there's flatlining economy throughout most of Western Europe. You've also got, China, which is not just buying pretty much all the gold, hitting record gold prices right now, bought all the tooling companies. They, trading on whether they can keep the rare earth materials. They're stopped exporting key components. They're trying to move the iPhone to India, and they won't let 20,000 iPhone employees from China go to India to train these people up. China's acting extremely strategically. And the West, all the Western countries are hugely indebted. Probably America's in the strongest position because you've got the reserve currency and you've got a very sensible energy policy. And at least you're aware of the problems. So I'd just be interested in what people think, because it really feels like a financial crisis. We're going to have another 2008, and we're in a much, much worse position to respond to it by just reducing interest rates or trying a quantitative easing or something. So it's more serious. It's going to be a much bigger, and it seems to me that there's a lot more at stake. Things will shift very, very quickly. The power relationships will change. So I'd be interested in what the panel thinks about that coming crisis. And secondly, just on a
Very, very
question for William.
Okay.
Okay. So if it's going to be bad, how do we make money out of it? What's the big short? William, what's the big short in the coming financial crisis?
I'd like to ask the panel if they can discern an essence to any new world order and what that would be.
I'd like specifically to address a wee point to Thomas Fazi. I would agree that I would disagree that we're in World War III. I think at the moment it's more latent than that. And what I would ask, not just yourself, Thomas, but obviously the entire panel, is what are the prospects for example, if one or two countries get their acts together, become more democratic, more self-interested, what are the prospects still for peaceful resolution to the undoubted tensions? And just as a wee sort of, I don't know, illustration of that, I was down at the Greenwich Museum a couple of days ago, and I saw the beautiful Baltic Exchange stained glass, which was commissioned and constructed in 1922. The Baltic Exchange represented trade, commerce, effectively peaceful prosperity. And then obviously World War I completely shattered that, and the Baltic glass was a commemoration and perhaps a reminder that there is another way. You know, that war is not, I mean, I know there's little wars at the moment. I know they're not little for those involved, but just what are the prospects for a peaceful resolution to this brewing crisis?
When COVID happened, I knew it wasn't a thing as it was being told. And it seems to be a biggest wealth transfer from the middle class of most countries, or certainly the Western countries, to this narrow group of people. And I started investigating, and I found out that, first of all, things that I'd never been taught at school, like the Federal Reserve was only set up in December 1913, and then we went into the First World War almost immediately after. And I found out that America had twice tried to resist having this fiat currency imposed on them. But we've continued this whole fiat currency. And in fact, from 2008 to COVID, it's almost like we're extending it, quantitative easing, and it's based on nothing. And so I think that is why we're now leading to wars, because all wars are bankers' wars, and I found out that World War II was in fact funded. Both sides were funded by bankers, which is nobody ever told me it, and that the Clintons, etc., they encouraged China to be admitted to the World Trade Organization to the detriment of their own people and the offshoring of all that industry. Why would you do that if you were particularly if you were Democrats, although I agree with Trump at the moment with what he's doing.
Okay. So we got too much on the table now. So the first person we come back will be you and you, but now I'm going to get the panel, and then we'll come straight back to the two of you. But first we'll get the panel. Can I just go in this order, Phil? This order here, yeah.
Sure. On the latecomer who's asking about what the essence of the New World Order is, I can just recommend that you watch the video, because my whole comment was explaining why I thought the New World Order wasn't a very useful concept, because it actually restricts our thinking as to all the different features going on. But anyway, on Andy's point about the coming world financial crisis, well, clearly for the last sort of 30, 40 years, there's always been a coming financial crisis, and we've been through quite a few of them. And you're right, there was another one coming somewhere. God knows where it's going to come. I don't know what Bill's going to recommend in terms of the financial strategy or where you put your portfolio. But I think its impact will be, not that much different from the previous ones, in that it will accelerate and it will amplify and it will magnify the sense of disorder. I think the theme of what I was trying to say was that we got to look at the specifics, and I think the specifics of how the next financial crisis, which could be in my mind a Western debt crisis, or it could be in the sort of non-banking financial system. Obviously, that's where all the pressures are at the moment: private credit, private equity, hedge funds, and so on. Could be any of these can be a trigger, and no one can predict how or what it is. But it's going to be how the different actors respond to that. Actors meaning countries respond to that. How is China going to respond to it? Is it going to do like what it did in 2008-9, which, although Gordon Brown tries to talk that up as a great example of, multilateral cooperation stuff, actually, The resolution of that on a global level was China's unilateral decision to help out. They felt they could help out. The West was in a mess. It was a financial crisis, based in Wall Street and in the other Western financial centers. And, for all the talking shops that there were then, China decided it had the strength. I think I agree with you. China has a strategic perspective in that it had the strength that it could pump money in and help the world stabilize, which is what it did. It didn't sort of kickstart recovery in the West. That's those problems are too big for even China to be able to stabilize. So it'll be like, how will China respond to the next one? It may not do it the same way. And now you have, India is obviously in a bigger position and so on. So it will happen. It will magnify things, but it won't necessarily, be the trigger for world war. Just to on the sort of, isn't it the question of people being too negative about war and is peace possible and so on? My emphasis on that is that the biggest threat to world disorder and war comes from within the Western nation states, comes from America, comes from all the other states, not just because of what Thomas said about Thucydides' trap, i.e., those that are in control don't want to lose control, and therefore there's a fight over it, but also because of the incoherence of the Western elites. That's the distinctive new thing. It's not just the old is going to try and hang on, which they always do. Britain tried to hang on, America's trying to hang on, but it's also the geopolitical illiteracy of the Western countries, that they don't know where their interests lie. And if they don't know where their interests lie, then they are doing things and have been doing things which are compounding the possibility of things getting out of control. Yeah, and that's very different scenario today than was the case in the 1930s and was the case in the 1910s. It's this lack of leadership, and that's our problem to sort out in different Western countries, to actually re-establish a political class which has a sense of where the country's national interests rise, and then those can be negotiated between different nation states.
Great, thanks, Bill. All the way by George.
Okay, we can make it work. Thank you. I would like to pick up on two of the remarks that were given right now about basically what I have to call conspiracy theories. And a French Prime Minister called Michel Rocard, he was Prime Minister to François Mitterrand in itself. It was an ordeal for him. And he said, never believe in conspiracies when an easier answer could be incompetence. Incompetence is common, and conspiracies require a great and subtle mind. And the most of the time, thinking that whoever, the Clintons, the Illuminati, the Bilderberg Conference, whatever, they can orient and pull proverbial springs in the world is complete nonsense. They are stumbling towards something, sometimes with the best of intentions. The Bilderberg Conference was created in the post-war years, essentially to bring people together so that they could foresee what they saw as, the ultimate disaster of the coming of Nazism and fascism. But it wasn't something where suddenly there would be a blueprint. I don't even think that the World Economic Forum in Davos are interested in much more than getting lots of people who will pay them vast amounts of money to strut in Davos for a few days. And I don't think these conspiracies exist. You have, however, ideas that swell up, that get fashionable, and that change our world. And you have also, people actually attacking you with planes and bombs and all of this. These are different things. So I don't find those reasons, but certainly I totally agree that there is a lack of consistency with our governments and the lack of long-term vision. And this is what Russia is a different animal, but this is what China wins, because China is a country of people who value education. They are a country of people who value hard work. They're not terribly interested in civil liberties, obviously, but that's so. And they find this. They think it's a strategic choice as much as an ideological choice. It's the Deng Xiaoping theory that I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as the cat catches mice, and this is how we get sort of smothered in Chinese goods in Europe. And they say, oh, it's junk and it's badly made, and Europe is going to regulate the fact that they do not follow our norms, which are protectionist measures that have a nice and civilized name. they produce good cars. They now produce good shoes. They will produce lots of good things, and we will be swamped. But and decisions have got to be taken, calling them by their name. We have, if you say, I want to protect my industry, I want to protect my people. This is why I raise tariffs, which is what Trump said. It is perfectly understandable. But I don't think there's any kind of conspiracy against the West, but there certainly are hostile agents. The Chinese view is we come first. The Russian view is we can't really come first. There's nothing manufactured that we actually export, a few planes perhaps, but nothing else. And therefore, we are going to fracture Western societies. And they've been doing this since the Tsars. The great sort of anti-Semitic tract, the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, was written by a Frenchman, I'm so proud, in the late 19th century and used by the Russians worldwide. And you still find it in print, in bookstores in Istanbul, in bookstores in all of the Arab world, etc. And it's now circulated on the internet. So what we are facing is not exactly a conspiracy, but something that doesn't tell its name and that will do anything great, small, efficient, not efficient, in terms of getting us to fight one another, because it's the ultimate efficiency. Is as long as we fight one another, we have no time to look at them. That's my point.
Great, thanks. Thomas, some responses.
So what can we imagine a new world order to be? Well, I don't think there will be a new world order. Neither should we aspire to one, because that's exactly the kind of system that we've lived under for 80 years, and that can only succeed if there's a single hegemon that is able to impose that on others. That's not the world we live in today. So I think the only possible solution to avoid war is not a new world order, but it's something I would say akin to the Order of Westphalia that we had in Europe. In 1648, European countries, after slaughtering each other for decades, for largely religious issues, but not only, decided to, realize that, okay, no one can win this war decisively, so we might as well establish a system where we accept to coexist, even if we have different, belief systems, i.e., Catholicism and Protestantism, and they agreed to establish a balance of power, and that was also, there was a geopolitical reasoning to that, and it was very successful. It succeeded in maintaining relative peace in Europe for quite some time, but it was also based on a respect of each other's, cultural and civilizational distinctiveness. That was a fundamental aspect of the Treaty of Westphalia. There's not, we have different value systems and religious systems, but we won't try to impose that system upon, my neighbors or other countries in Europe, because there's not one single system cannot prevail in Europe. We have decades of war to prove that. So let's find some way of coexisting, and it worked pretty well. And I would say that's the kind of system that we need on a global level, sort of a global Peace of Westphalia, where we agree that there's no single power that can, win and become a new global hegemon. Neither Russia nor China want to replace America as the single global hegemon, especially China, despite the kind of, rhetoric that we hear here in Europe, China wants to take over the world. That is not true. I mean, because they've seen where that leads to. They've seen America collapse under the weight of its global empire within a few decades. They're smart enough not to want to repeat that. So when they say, we don't want to take over the world, we want to build a new order, which is based on, and Phil mentioned it, sovereign equality, respect for other countries, non-interference in the affairs of other countries, exactly the kind of, principles that the Peace of Westphalia was based on. I think they are genuine. That's the world they want to build. And we don't have to like the domestic political systems of those countries to believe that and to see why that would benefit everyone. And not liking the domestic regimes of those countries and being able to pursue this anyway is what will maybe get us through this. And that's why I'm kind of concerned when I hear people like, I mean, the way Anne-Elisabeth describes the world seems to be, it's one of the West, again, with enemies at the gates everywhere, China, Russia, I mean, and that will definitely lead us to war. I mean, that mindset will definitely lead us to war. I mean, if we think that we are in an existential clash of civilizations and we're fighting for our survival against evil countries and civilizations that want to take us over, then I think we can wager that within my lifetime, we are all going to die. I mean, we really have to find a mindset where we can live with the fact that, there, China, Russia, and other countries, Iran, there are other civilizations, other way of organizing collective life, other way of understanding nation states that do exist, and we have to respect that. And I think that would be, as Phil said, in everyone's interest, including us Westerners. When I finished, when we speak of the collapse of the Western order, I mean, we're not, no one's hoping for, civilization to collapse in Europe. I mean, that would imply the collapse of the kind of globalist system that we are already fighting against, So let's not allow elites to frame, their interests as the collective interests of the West, because that is not true at all.
Okay. William?
I know it's the premise of the panel, but I'm still confused by the idea of the collapse of the world order, because I don't think there was a world order. The UN, that's certainly always been my perspective. I don't think it's unusual in the U.S. I mean, I always viewed the UN as some place where we're all in the same place and we can talk, but it never had any authority to me. It never had any moral authority. It never had, the only time the UN act would be if China, Russia, and the U.S. happened to agree on something. And we didn't need the UN for the China, the U.S., and Russia to agree on something. So I don't think there was this hegemonic world order. So I don't think it's collapsing. And this idea that we're holding on to, trying to hold on to our top spot, I just don't think that's how we've seen it. And to your question on the Clintons, and I voted for Bill Clinton both times, and I voted for Trump, so maybe I need therapy. But but it does tell you something about the consciousness. But I think they honestly thought that if you gave free trade, it would be it'd be in our interest, because it would get everybody to want to be like us, and we'd have more efficiency, and everybody would prosper from it. And in some ways that looks really dumb now, because we ended up exporting all our manufacturing. It also looks kind of smart because, if China did put in money, why? Because we're all interdependent now. So on the one hand, this grand experiment of I forget what they call it, global liberalism or whatever, it's been a failure, but it's also kind of succeeded too. Like, we tend to go to such extremes. I don't think we're going to have a war with China, because it'd be really bad for China, it'd be really bad for us, and we're not stupid. So I don't think we're going to have a world war. And ironically, Trump's kind of a fascinating guy, because his greatest gift, I think, is he doesn't respect dogma. The fact you're not supposed to say something, he doesn't care. The fact that you're not supposed to look that way, he doesn't care. And then when he says things, a lot of people are going, you're right. You know what I mean? And now he also says it in such a way that everybody else, you also cringe. So almost every time he says something, you have to go like, no way. Well, there's something there. No. There's something. Like he had this great quote that he was able to get the Arab countries to participate in the Gaza peace with tariffs, and the tariffs are bringing world peace. And the fact that I can now make a point with tariffs is bringing people together. You first you really go, what? And then you're like, I get it. No, I know what he's saying, which is, by saying, look, we're not just going to ask that you have open borders anymore. We're going to impose consequences if you don't. If you put up trade barriers, there's going to be consequences. I actually think this is very healthy, because it's a conversation that should have been happening for decades. And it probably hasn't, partly because of our arrogance, but also because we honestly thought we were in such a strong position that everyone would just want to be like us. But that's ignoring the fact that, China really doesn't necessarily want to be like us. There are other things besides economic prosperity. That doesn't mean you have to go to war. So I don't think there was a world order, but I don't think the idea of trying to make countries interdependent was actually a failure. I think it largely succeeded, and we're adjusting it. We probably started adjusting a little too late. We probably exacerbated it in the U.S. by pouring money into theater conflicts that without a strategy to actually get out of them. But I don't think that it's all coming to a close. In terms of the next financial crisis, who knows? I mean, who thought we'd come out of the pandemic pretty strong in some ways, So the world's pretty resilient. I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I can't tell you what the big play is because then I can't make it. But
Great, thanks. Okay, let's come out. Okay, so I said I'd start with you and then the guy in the glasses.
We've got a multipolar world, declining Britain. What role should Britain, what should Britain aspire to bring to the table if it wants to prosper and be relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I want to to disagree with Fazi on this very problematic argument that you're making, that there is some kind of complete collapse of Western hegemony and disinavailability of war. I think it's extremely problematic statement, because you need to remember that history is determined by the action of people and nation, and there is nothing inevitable about this. It's very dangerous argument from my perspective. And so I would like to ask the panel to explain, because here we're talking about the decline of the West economically, that's correct, but politically, we are still the major democracy. The US still controls the entire markets, the dollar and everything. So I wonder whether you could, maybe the panel could explain a bit more the strategy that Trump is pursuing. Could it really be, because I think that's the key, it is not completely challenging the entire order. They seem to have an agenda. And I think here in the West and in our press, it is presented as totally irrational, as the coming back of brutal nationalism. But I think that we have to go deeper into the Trump administration and to some of you, could they explain what they're trying to do economically? Because they're saying that they want to rebuild America, the manufacturing base. Could they succeed? And could Europe, if they were successful, could Europe follow that example? Rather than Europe decoupling from America, couldn't the new right, which is coming into power, couldn't they follow the American example of remanufacturing as a way to deal with the decline?
I'd be interested to hear more. This is the battle of ideas, and I've heard a lot about the old world order and its failings, but it did have a story to tell. It had a story to tell to people around the world about democracy and liberalism, Francis Fukuyama idea, and so on. Okay, maybe some of it was bullshit, fine. But there was a story there. What if the critics would say, well, thank God the old world order is finished? Well, what have you got to compete? What have you got to inspire people? What's your big idea that will get people back home hopeful again about whatever follows that old world order?
We're talking about the New World Order here, and just this year we've seen a lot of revolt in Morocco, Madagascar, and Nepal with these Gen Z riots. And they're structured very horizontally, and that is very antithetical to how the world works at the moment. So what is the likelihood that Western democracy is going to evolve into a more horizontal way of thinking and a horizontal way of structure?
Thank you.
Okay, a very simple question for Thomas. I heard you talking about China. When was the last time you spent time in China?
Phil, just one thing to respond on.
Well, the gentleman in the sunglasses, I think, dark glasses. What's the story? Well, what I was trying to explain earlier is that the story comes after something has been created. When I was saying in terms of the way in which New World Order is discussed, there wasn't really a story during the 1930s as to how the world should be better organized. It more evolved through the process of economic conflict and political conflict and military conflict. And it was clear going into that war that, America was one who had the industrial might, and depending on what America did would determine the outcome of the war. The story about the Fukuyama, liberal democracy is the only way, the end of history and all that, comes very much at the end of the order. The order had already broken down by the time Fukuyama was talking about this lovely story, a lovely narrative, which he was hoping the world would retain or would still believe. And it was over by that stage. You know, the end of the Cold War was the thing which began the unraveling of that process. So what I'm saying is, I think we have to start not with a story, a nice description or a nice narrative. We have to start from looking at what are the forces which are moving us towards potentially a different way of organizing relations between countries. And I think for that, I think the dominant thing, apart from my emphasis on, you know, the incoherence of the West, and just to say, for someone said, what is the question about, you know, what's Trump doing? You know, Trump's doing a whole lot of things, some quite interesting and some very dangerous and disruptive, you know, because I don't think, and this is an example of me saying that the Western elites are leaderless and don't have any authority and don't have any vision, is that's an incoherent plan. You know, great that he tried to, you know, crack back on the regulatory state. Great that he, you know, got rid of DEI policies and so on. A lot of things were very positive, but I don't think there's a coherent plan there. And therefore, that's my emphasis for America, is that it is an example of the geopolitical illiteracy, which is going to cause problems. The other thing I'd just like to throw into the discussion in terms of looking at what will create the future is the rise of the West. I mean, I just don't rise of the rest, rather. I don't see the world that Bill sees. You know, it is completely changed now. I'm not an economic determinist, but even 25 years ago, the Western industrial production share of the world was about 3/4. Today, it's about 40%. Yeah. You know, it is. China took over from America in about 2010 in terms of industrial production. We're talking about GNP and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of who produces things in the world has changed. That balance has changed. And that, I say, not as an economic determinist, but if you have the rest of the world outside the West producing 60% of industrial production, they are going to want some power to go with that.
Great. Thanks.
That's what's got to be negotiated.
Anne-Elisabeth?
I'm going to pick up on the question is what should Britain aspire to? Because I think you should ask a foreigner. We have cliche views of your nation, which are superficially stupid and actually sort of carry the conception that we have and that you used to have of your own nation. And therefore, the examination in a new world, in a modern world of Britain, is to think, what is it that we achieved? Good or bad, it doesn't matter, but what it is that worked for us and work towards that. I think that's what you should be doing. Be more British, do not be less British, do not be part of the mix, do not be the yogurt that you can sell to 40 nations, be Britain. And be Britain is sort of more efficient way if possible, and if possible too, or Ben, you've done this in the past, however, what people say, try and do it with sort of a few values thrown in. That would be nice too. Don't arrest sort of comedians. 5 cops at the airport, armed cops, sort of arrest a comedian because he tweeted something they didn't like. That is terrifying, and it is un-British. And I say this as a French woman.
Thank you. Thomas, just one thing, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to disappoint, but the collapse of Western hegemony is a historical fact, and the sooner we accept it, the better. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of people, haven't, lived great lives, even in the West, under this unipolar system. So it's okay. We should just accept it. It's okay. And it is a fact, not just in economic terms, but the West has also completely lost its soft power, and so the big ideas, democracy, the rules-based order. No, I mean, clearly, though, we've exposed the fact that the hypocrisy of the West has been completely exposed. No one believes those stories anymore because we're trampling over those principles, day in and day out. So, which is why other countries don't look at the West as a model anymore. They don't look at Western liberal, democratic, free capitalist systems as a model, and that's that's okay. And in terms of what big idea, we don't need a new grand big idea for reorganizing the world, as I said earlier. And I think the question should be, what kind of life do we want in our countries? I mean, that's the big question we need to address. Not, how is, what is Britain's contribution to the new world order going to be? That's a ridiculous question to ask. The question should be, what kind of life do we want in our countries, in Britain, in France, in Italy, in Europe, and in the West? That should be the questions we should be asking ourselves.
Good. Okay. Well,
I'll take the one on what's Trump doing. I think and I don't know is the real answer, but I think the strategy is not as dramatic as it comes off. I think he's every time he says I want 100% tariffs, he's quite explicit. He wants to cut a deal, and it ends up being 15, or we get some relief here, you get there. That's what he's doing. So he's not. And I think the market's finally figured that out, because the market used to react to everything he says, which isn't helpful, because he's being pretty clear. That's not really what he's going to do. He's trying to negotiate. So at a sort of a short-term level, what he's trying to do is what he just did with a bunch of pharmaceutical companies. They're going to do manufacturing in the U.S. They're going to not charge us 3 times as much for drugs. He's trying to address some of what is the view in the U.S. that we've been kind of played a little bit. He's trying to negotiate that stuff. And that's not, to me, a global shift in reality. The longer term thing he's trying to do is address what Phil was talking about, which is our industrial base has eroded, and that's a more fundamental problem. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any short fix for that. I mean, you've got to it's probably a decades-long fix, and it may have a trade barriers involved. That's probably more the cap on it. You got to have manufacturing capability. You've got to have an educated workforce. You've got to change the culture. We have a culture of entitlement. Nobody wants to do those jobs. It's very common refrain. We have to deal with that. Public schools have declined, in my opinion. I live in a town that historically had one of the best school systems in the country. Almost everybody knows, pull the kids out and put them in private schools. We're not in. So, I mean, I think both judging it in the short term is a mistake, and expecting there to be a solution in the short term is a mistake. And it's going to take a while, but I think that's ultimately the strategy, is to try to unwind the clock so that we're not, we have more, we can be the arsenal of democracy again. And I think that's a serious issue. It's going to take time.
Great. Thank you. Okay. There's lots of hands. I want to try and get everyone in before I ask the panel to close.
I speak a bit of Italian, and I even speak a bit of American. But I must differ from our friends here. I mean, Thomas, you said, it's all connected. And we heard a fairly familiar follow the money kind of contribution from a lady at the front there. But if there's nothing to preserve about Western values, if Western hegemony is completely down the tube, I think I'm listening much more to Noam Chomsky or the Italian Communist Party than to reality. Because when you attack Thomas, Anne-Marie, we're far too friendly in this discussion. Anne-Elisabeth, I'm sorry. That's all I can do to stand up right now. So you've got to give me a break. No, not that kind of break. When you attack Anne-Elisabeth, you say that
Okay, come on. Just let the man finish. Let's go on.
You say that you caricature her as we're being her view that we're being assailed on all fronts. But if Britain is unable to allow Israeli football fans into its country, then I would say that the clash of civilizations, which is so often dismissed by leftist critics, is alive and well and living in Britain today. And we'd be very foolish to deny that. Now, if I may turn my fire to William.
Very quickly, come on.
It's all very well to talk about interdependence between, but I think different countries. But the new face of foreign direct investment is when you expel thousands of Koreans in America because they haven't passed their visas, and when you demand that the Japanese invest $500 billion in America and you take most of the proceeds. So foreign direct investment is no guarantee of dwindling tensions. You must know this, William, and prepare for what might happen.
I think it's a little bit dismissive to say it's maybe a conspiracy theory or even incompetence when I don't want to believe that we haven't learned anything from the Clintons, like the lady said, for example. Like right now, the EU is it's almost like purposely killing the economy, right? Like Germany, so much manufacturing is just almost impossible because it's like, oh, you have to have these eco-friendly requirements and things like that. But at the end of the day, all that's achieving is like people buying more Chinese cars in this instance, for example, is the example that I was thinking of, right? And let's be honest, that's not really helping the environment, is it? Because they don't care. They don't have the same regulations as we do. So I think it is worth mentioning that and looking into that, because I refuse to believe it's like organic. I think there's something there. Maybe it is worth looking into who really is benefiting from this, because it's obviously not us. So
one of the sessions yesterday finished with a question about how would we respond if China were to take over Taiwan? And I was thinking about that. Is that kind of a scare score, if you like, a scare story that's meant to get us to sign up to a new world order? Or is it, I mean, clearly if that happened, it would be a very real practical problem for most of the countries that people here live in. But it kind of, I think it raises for me the question of just the idea of national interest that the various kind of panel members have touched on. And on the one hand, how do we defend that sort of idea of, you know, national sovereignty and hold on to, if you like, the kind of the gains of Western civilization without sort of being forced up to line up behind, you know, Keir Starmer's foreign policy? And that feels like a bit of a kind of a tension. You know, there are real practical problems that need to be dealt with today, but we don't have the tools, the democratic tools to respond to them.
Thank you for the enlightening panel. So my question is a little bit economics in nature, since we're talking about the big world order. So the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world, constituting almost 60% of any country's reserve portfolio, okay? However, it's been shrinking, followed swiftly by the Canadian dollar. So does the panel think that if it was to be replaced, which currency would take its place? Any thoughts?
Yeah, Ewan Grant, I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked many times in Ukraine, including in the months running up to the Revolution of Dignity and immediately after. Anne-Elisabeth is 100% correct. Cock up, not conspiracy. And I speak as someone who stood next to Lee Harvey Oswald's window. And that was cock up, not conspiracy. Question, based on Phil's comments, who, if any, is addressing the geopolitical illiteracy among Western elites? And I would urge all the panel and anybody in the audience to have a word with Thomas afterwards and ask some awkward questions about the Maduro regime in Venezuela and drugs trafficking. This gets Corbynites very uneasy. Thank you, everyone.
On Israel, but specifically in relation to these tectonic shifts that you talked about, Jacob, not getting into a moral argument with Thomas, which would take us all day to resolve. It seems to me, obviously, there's a lot going on in relation to these shifts, including American relative decline. But for me, the most striking change over the past 30 or 40 years is much more in relation to American domestic policy. Because if you look at America in the 80s, say, for better or worse, there was a huge consensus among Democrats and Republicans that Israel should be supported, it's a strategic asset, we must back it. Whereas now, America is much more divided. America is much more divided, as it is on many other issues. So you have some people, broadly the Trump camp, who say, yes, we have to support nation states, we have to support a more kind of muscular foreign policy, therefore we'll lean more towards Israel. But you have, developing from the Obama administration, but becoming stronger and stronger, another camp saying, no, we need to rely much more on international institutions, like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. We need to be much more conciliatory towards Iran. So it seems to me, maybe this is part of what Phil calls incoherence, but it seems to me you also have a big division within the Western elites about how they should deal with big geopolitical questions. And Israel is just one example of that.
One thing I'm not sure we've really quite nailed, and maybe we can't, but I'm left a little bit with the question of if things are shifting so much, and if some of the, say, competitor or rising powers spotting opportunities, how does that play out in relation to the fact that they are going to inevitably pursue quite a muscular version of their own self-interest? and when that infringes, say, on our interests, how you resolve that in sort of kind of cuddly way that I'm slightly characterizing Thomas's position? Is it like even possible to reconcile that when China's accused of having massive spying operations taking over critical industries? It's not doing that just because it's like wants a happy world where everybody holds hands, right? They've got an interest there. And how do we tease these things out? How do we manage them internationally when everyone's kind of got a more muscular approach to their own self-interest? Or maybe that was always the case and we muddled through so far. But anyway, I speak just a little bit to give my panelists some time to gather their thoughts so we know how we're going to conclude. But Anne-Elisabeth, some final thoughts to leave us with. I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes or so.
Okay. I need to try and sort of step back a bit and ask people to consider the texture of history. The texture of history is not that one period is one way, but every single period had a bit of the past in it, a bit of the present, and a bit of the future. And we have human memory, we have books, we have a whole ecosystem in which we have been educated. The bands that separate our age classes are probably the most efficient and the most impossible to go across. But that means that we cohabit in possibly 6, 7, 8 bands of age in which our perception is slightly different, and that you add to this our experience, our national experience, our international experience, what we lived through. People who've lived through wars have different experiences than the others. And so what we ought to do also is to step back and say the richness of our world is this complexity. When you've got countries that have an ancient civilization like Egypt, and demographics is such that 80% of the population is under 25, a great deal of memory is lost. We have actually this as a strength. This strength is what we have to preserve, and the complexity and the multiplicity of our civilization, as we call it, and which I'm very proud of, is something that we really should see in that perspective. And the only way that we're not AI, we are natural intelligence. There were lots of intelligence, more than the computer. This is what we ought to get together and be aware of. We're all different. Our histories are different. Our world is different. This is what we've got today. Work with it.
William, some final thoughts.
I'll just jump on the Korean issue you raised. I thought that was idiotic. I think most of us do think that was idiotic. And what you were raising, where the current expulsion of the Korean War, when Korea was coming over to build a plan, they expelled I don't know anybody who doesn't think that was idiotic. But it's the way that we have succeeded is we're glad they came and we hope they stay, right? And if they have skills that we need for manufacturing, double bonus. So I don't, for what it's worth, that wasn't a popular play. I think I'm not even sure they actually had a problem with their immigration status either when it played out. But the bigger issue that raises is these things are kind of being thrown together. We have an immigration problem, but expelling Koreans here, helping us build plants is not the right answer, right? So we need to, for these to reindustrialize, you need to have an immigration, education, maybe trade policies that work together, and that's a work in progress. And that was an example of a failure. So, and that's the general perception.
Thomas.
So just to reply to a couple of statements. I wouldn't define myself a Corbynista. I'm an old school socialist, which puts me at odds with a lot of conservatives on economic issues, but also puts me at odds with most of the mainstream left today on cultural issues. So, very lonely place to be. But that's why I'm here today. So, but it's so I don't support mass immigration. I'm fully aware of the negative consequences of mass immigration. I don't support open borders. I'm perfectly aware of the effect that has on social cohesion and any country's cultural and social identity. That's not a clash of civilizations, though. That's just the fact that you do have different cultures and civilizations in the world, and you shouldn't import another culture or civilization into your own country. That doesn't mean you have to go to war with the people that subscribe to a different civilization, which actually happens to be what we've been doing for a very long time. Just look at all the wars we've waged in the Middle East over the past 20 years. Millions of deaths, trying to impose our values, democracy and whatnot. That didn't work out too well. And in fact, is one of the main reasons why we've had, such mass immigration over the same period. So I think there's maybe, we've all got contradictory aspects in our thinking. I think in terms of the question about the reserve currency, but it's the same thing that I said earlier. Like, everyone expects that, okay, if the dollar, if the dollar is no longer the reserve currency, which currency is going to replace the dollar? No currency is going to replace the dollar. You're not going to have a monopolistic reserve currency ever again, precisely because what is emerging is a multipolar order, and that will lead to a multi-currency order, which is exactly what China openly favors. So China, in its exchanges with other countries, in its trade with other countries, does not impose the yuan. It allows countries to trade in their own currency, and that's the best possible system one can imagine, because it frees countries in their trade from having to use a single sort of hegemonic currency. So that's a system that I think we'll end up with, and it's a system that I think will again benefit everyone. And again, I return to what I was saying earlier. China doesn't not want to impose its own currency as a monopolistic currency out of goodwill or generosity. Again, it's because it's seen how the reserve currency, having the world's reserve currency in the long term destroys your economy, destroys your industrial base. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. is facing many of the problems that we've been talking about, the erosion of the industrial base. That has largely to do with you can't have a reserve currency and a flourishing industrial base at the same time, because you have to constantly be exporting your currency. Long story, but China gets that, and so they don't want to impose themselves in that respect. And again, I think someone asked when was the last time I was in China. Last year, October, I think. I've been there quite a few times. I've got a lot of friends in China, so I engage with the Chinese on a regular basis. I'm not sure what the question was supposed to imply, but that's the answer. And just coming back to you, again, of course, I'm not saying that none of that is happening, but let's also try to be critical when it comes to mainstream narrative. The mainstream narrative, that the elites are putting out regarding China, regarding Russia. I find it surprising that a lot of people on the in the critical sphere, they're fully aware that governments lie about pretty much everything on a regular basis, but somehow they tend to take at face value the narrative. The narratives on issues that they happen to agree with. So I would say let's have a bit of a more critical attitude. I'm not saying that's not happening, but also, I think I return to what I was saying earlier. I think there was a research paper that was put out, and I can find the link for whoever's interested in reading it. And these researchers literally went through thousands of statements and documents put out by the Chinese government and made by Chinese officials over the years. And they concluded, look, the consistency of the message is impressive. These people do not want to, create a new China-led world order. So, the way you address those issues is you sit down around a table. And which is what we've, refused to do for a very long time. Yeah.
Great. Phil, your final thoughts?
Thanks. Okay, so big picture, we got tectonic plates shifting, a world where things I think are more broken down than are ordered, multi-alignment, multi-coalition, fluidity. Okay, so what can we best do about that to prevent conscious or an accidental global conflagration? I think the key pointer to us is the question about national interest. And I think national interest is something we need to talk more about and also define, not as define as in a list of things, a list of policies which equate to a national interest, but to recognize that national interest in today's discussion is being too often crudely equated with attacking any other country you don't agree with, or trying to contain them, or trying to demonize them. On that point, I entirely agree with Thomas. The narrative of demonizing China as taking over the world is a very distorting narrative. What national interest means And this is where I think Britain, given that's where we're sitting at the moment, I know, every else on the panel has got other countries where they're going to go back to, but I happen to be in this country where Britain can make a difference. Isn't, because it should really be, hang on to its great power status and its seat at the UN and all that thing, but to give an example of what pursuing national interest can mean. And it's not going to come from the top. It's not going to come from Starmer. It's going to come from people discussing around the country what is in Britain's national interest. What's the national interest in the longer... national interest to me means what is in the long-term interest of the people of this country within these borders. Security-wise, yes. Economy, yes. Social cohesion, yes. Number of other things to say. It's what is in the interest of the people, the long-term interest of the people as a whole. And that's something we can discuss and we can debate. And it doesn't mean following Starmer's foreign policy, but it means establishing a sense that we all are in this together, because we happen to live and are citizens of a particular geographical boundary, a particular nation state. And the thing which I think is not understood is that if everyone were to pursue their national interests, if Britain pursued her national interests and gave that sort of example, that doesn't make war more likely, it makes war less likely. Because as Thomas also said earlier, if everyone was pursuing their national interests, what's from the interest of their people, not narrow sectional interests, but the interest of the people, of the populace as a whole, then those interests can be negotiated between countries. Whereas if it's perceived and presented as, going back to religions of the Westphalian period, or value systems, or cultures, or, different political systems which you might disagree with, those things cannot be negotiated away. The only thing we can negotiate is our interests and how those interests can relate to other countries' national interests in a way that can be something which doesn't impair the others. So we have to get away from a foreign relations based on value systems and, liberal democracy is the only way the world can be. There will never be a coherent value system across the world. We're going to have 200 nations. They will have different systems, different cultures, different values. But if we all had a sense, starting in Britain, of negotiating on the basis of our interests of the people, then that is something which could actually create an arrangement whereby different countries with different values could get on together.
Great, thank you.